Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We'll get started with the webinar, which is Greenshank's first ever webinar, where we're going to be giving a run through of new approaches to delivering robust nutrient mitigation solutions, which we'll see a very hot topic at the moment, even so hot it made it into yesterday's budget, which will see quite good to see that we're getting that much attention now. So, moving on, just a quick outline of what we're going to go through today. We will be talking through an overview of the nutrient mitigation solutions that Greenshank Environmental are going to be pursuing, that we're looking to deploy for our clients. We're going to give a run through of how we can go about finding those opportunities, and then the next steps to actually deploying those solutions. As a quick note, we are kind of assuming that everyone on this webinar has a kind of working knowledge of nutrient neutrality, so we're not going to go into the ins and outs of sort of why nutrient neutrality is a problem and the drivers for it. We're kind of going on the assumption everyone here knows that it's a problem, understands basically there's a requirement for nutrient mitigation to support housing development in the affected areas of the country, and that's what we're going to be focusing on, is those solutions and how we go about finding places to deploy them and the process to deploy them. Before we move on to the content, we'll just have a little talk about housekeeping. So obviously microphones will remain muted throughout the presentation. There's a question and answer function should be any kind of toolbar that you get with your Zoom window. If you have any questions, then please type them in the Q&A section. There's also an ability to sort of upvote questions. So if you see a question that somebody else has asked that you think is particularly pertinent, then you can upvote that question, and we'll obviously deal with the kind of most upvoted questions first at the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. My business partner and also brother Kim is behind the scenes kind of collating all the questions, and he will be asking the questions at the end during the Q&A. We also have a couple of polls that will be popping up during the webinar, so they'll pop up on your screen for you to answer, and the webinar is being recorded, and we'll have a recording made available on our website, and also a link sent around to those who have attended. For those of you who aren't sort of too aware of Greenshank Environmental, brief introduction to us as a company. So we were founded last year to tackle nutrient neutrality. So our mission is basically to help clients achieve nutrient neutral development in the areas that are affected around the UK. We started the company off the back of our deep experience delivering projects as consultants in order to help clients kind of figure out nutrient strategies to delivering nutrient mitigation. That's been working on projects for local planning authorities. I've done a lot of work supporting Natural England in terms of some of the key bits of work that have underpinned their strategic response to nutrient neutrality, and have also worked for various developers in terms of looking at solutions, sort of bringing forward solutions to their specific developments. We're taking all of that experience and putting it into a process to actually bring schemes forward, and we're kind of doing that in two separate ways. The first is looking at site-specific mitigation strategies. So where we have a developer client who requires mitigation solutions for their developments, we can look to run an end-to-end process, which we'll go through in a bit more detail later in the presentation, that will bring a nutrient mitigation strategy to bear for their development. But we're also looking at bringing our own schemes to market, where we would then have the ability to provide nutrient mitigation sort of credits for sale to developers who need them in affected areas. So that's a really brief overview of Greenshank Environmental, and moving on now to the kind of meat of the presentation. We'll start by giving you a run through of the nutrient mitigation solutions that we're backing, why we're backing them, and also a couple that we know are kind of being quite widely used but don't think work particularly well. First off, everyone has most people who are kind of aware of issues to nutrient neutrality will be well aware that one of the key solutions that people talk about is wetlands. I have added a sort of prefix to wetlands here and said treatment wetlands, which is a specific type, which for those of you who have read the Natural England Wetland Mitigation Guidance, which I appreciate might not be that many of you, I actually have not particularly fond memories of reading that guidance when I had COVID about 1.5 years ago. Not the best way to spend your time, but it was quite interesting. And that wetland guidance actually has different types of wetlands, and treatment wetlands are the ones that provide the most certainty in terms of the nutrient mitigation they can deliver. And those wetlands, treatment wetlands, are those that are deployed at high nutrient sources of water. So we're kind of talking about putting wetlands at the end of sort of what we call point sources, things like wastewater treatment works, industrial discharges, or potentially taking sort of highly concentrated farmyard runoff, which can put a lot of nutrients into a wetland system. And the benefit of doing this is that you don't need to have as big a wetland, and you can basically deliver more mitigation for a smaller footprint. So you get far more out of a wetland if you can put in a big source of nutrients rather than putting in a kind of low concentration source of nutrients. Now, these are great solutions for providing strategic kind of level mitigation benefits, but they are quite complex to get approved. You do need to do quite a lot of work in terms of feasibility studies and a lot of design, and there's a lot of engineering requirements in terms of actually getting one of these schemes in the ground and functioning. However, we do have a really good, robust evidence base to show that they do function very well. As I said, there is this supporting guidance from Natural England that is incredibly useful for knowing that you've got that confidence that these schemes will deliver if you put them in the right places. But the kind of flip side of that, in terms of having the right places, having these sources of water that are highly nutrient enriched, that go into these, to put into these wetlands, means that there is, relatively speaking, a kind of smaller number of opportunities where you could go and deploy these schemes. There's also a need, to put quite a bit of effort into the design work, and potentially you need to do some monitoring in order to understand, the kind of key design parameters for a wetland system, and then also to use those design parameters to quantify what the wetland would actually deliver in terms of an amount of nutrient mitigation. This all leads to a long deployment time. So you've also got potential planning process to add on to that. So there's lots of complexities in terms of getting these schemes through. But if you do them in the right places, they can deliver a significant amount of mitigation, and they are very robust in terms of using nature-based solutions for nutrient mitigation. The other thing that's really worth considering with these is that the TAL upgrade. So those of you that are familiar with the levelling up bill, sort of question asked about that. So TAL upgrades is the levelling up bill has an amendment or amendments in it that are, if the bill passes as is, going to require water companies to upgrade wastewater treatment works in areas affected by nutrient neutrality to what is referred to as technically achievable limits. That is basically the best standard of nitrogen and phosphorus removal that can be achieved at wastewater treatment works, and it massively reduces the concentration of water that's leaving a wastewater treatment works, and it's being applied, if the legislation goes ahead unamended, to any wastewater treatment works serving a population greater than 2,000 people, which is actually not that big, relatively speaking. As I mentioned previously, the best place to put a wetland is somewhere where you have a high input source of nutrients. If you upgrade a wastewater treatment works to the best level of phosphorus or nitrogen stripping it can achieve, you're not going to have as much nutrients going into a wetland system at a wastewater treatment works. This then means that you just basically wouldn't really get as much bang for your buck deploying a wetland at one of these locations. So if the TAL upgrades go ahead as currently proposed in the levelling up bill, this will basically potentially quite significantly reduce the amount of opportunities for deploying treatment wetlands at wastewater treatment works. And as a consequence of this, the water sector is actually lobbying government to have a change to the way in which this kind of upgrade provision is worded to allow for more of these nature-based solutions like treatment wetlands to contribute to the problem that the current legislation is kind of aimed at tackling. So yeah, there's this kind of things that need to be considered about the number of opportunities, but as it stands, there are sort of a larger number of opportunities at the moment than there might be in the future should the TAL upgrades sort of go ahead. So yeah, treatment wetlands kind of, as I said, we think they're a great option in terms of strategic level solutions, and could provide a lot of mitigation for relatively low footprint. As we mentioned, though, there's not necessarily a huge number of opportunities or places to put treatment wetlands. So we also have other solutions that we think are really kind of key in terms of providing opportunities for generating mitigation at scale. Now, riparian buffer strips are one of the measures that's kind of got a fair amount of attention as well from various different organisations that are looking to deploy nutrient mitigation solutions. Buffer strips are one of the measures that I'm aware Natural England are going to be supporting. So in my previous role, I was leading a project that was developing a guidance document very similar to the wetland one that's already been released by Natural England, that is promoting other forms of nature-based solutions, and that's the ones we're going to talk through next. One of those is riparian buffers, and for those of you who aren't familiar with riparian buffers, effectively, as you can see, the kind of this type of stream that we're all kind of used to seeing in agricultural environments here, the kind where you've got kind of agriculture going right up to the edge of a watercourse. There's no kind of, as we call, buffering by the environment there to trap nutrients and stop them going straight into a watercourse, which is obviously what we're ultimately kind of trying to achieve through deploying these kind of nutrient mitigation solutions. So if we plant these sort of vegetated buffer strips along watercourses that currently don't have them, this can allow for natural processes to trap and cycle nutrients in the environment. As I'm sure you're all aware from going for walks in the countryside, there are a lot of these kind of little rivers that have that don't have these buffer zones next to them. So there are quite a lot of opportunities to deploy these solutions, because we've got so many of the watercourses that have had their buffer zones removed. They're also relatively simple solutions, but you do kind of need the right location to have a solution that A, meets all the feasibility criteria, and B, actually will deliver a decent amount of mitigation. There's been quite a lot of prior research into how riparian buffers sort of function for nutrient removal. So there's this good evidence base that allows for slightly higher efficiency estimates. It's really worth mentioning at this point with things like riparian buffers and the next couple of measures that we're going to discuss, that there is a need to specify in advance a sort of efficiency with which they remove the nutrients that go into them. And to do that, we've got to look at the literature. It's difficult to kind of predict in the same way that you can do for wetlands, using sort of engineering approaches, what a riparian buffer might deliver. But there are kind of literature, there's values in the literature that can be used to support these kind of estimates of percentage efficiencies. Another good thing about riparian buffers is they are fairly simple to design. We are talking about basically offsetting, having a strip a certain sort of fixed distance wide, or fixed width along these watercourses, and having a kind of planting design that uses native vegetation to basically act as a kind of filter for nutrients within the environment. As mentioned previously, we think that there's actually lower to sort of medium mitigation potential for these schemes, but because you can deploy them in quite a lot of locations, there's lots of opportunities. The fact that there's perhaps a lower mitigation potential than you'd get from, say, a big strategic wetland scheme means that there's still good opportunities to kind of do more of them in order to generate a decent amount of mitigation. The land take for them as well, I mean, we're probably looking at wanting to deploy buffer strips of kind of at least 10 meters wide along watercourses, which obviously if you start kind of looking at doing that at scale along sort of many kilometers of watercourse, the actual land take for that does start to kind of creep up a bit. And there are various various feasibility issues that we would need to address that mean that they're not going to be suitable in all locations, and that could be because there just isn't a particularly sort of large area that drains into them, meaning that there isn't lots of nutrients coming from the surrounding environment going into riparian buffers, meaning that they won't generate lots of mitigation, or it could be that other environmental factors just mean that they're actually not particularly suitable for a given location. All of that needs to be tackled in feasibility studies, which we'll talk a bit more about later. The next measure that we're looking at is what we term engineered log jams. Now, what we're looking to do with these is actually replicate the kind of damming activities that beavers do on streams. When we originally started looking at these in the project that I mentioned previously for Natural England, we kind of started with thinking about beaver reintroduction, but obviously, as I think quite a few of you will probably be aware, there is a requirement with all of these schemes to deliver the scheme in perpetuity, which in practical terms means sort of a scheme needing to be in place for 80+ years. And unfortunately, beavers are perhaps a bit too flighty to be relied upon to stay in one place, building dams for 80 or more years. If they even live for 80 years, you know, we can't really guarantee the beaver offspring sticking around either. So what we're looking to do is use solutions that we can basically build in place that replicate what beavers do, which replicates the processes that beaver dams facilitate, which again trap and cycle nutrients in the environment. And that can potentially be an approach to generating nutrient mitigation. Again, we've got lots of small watercourses and agricultural landscapes that give us plenty of opportunities for potentially being able to deploy these schemes. And we also know that if we can put them in the right place, then we can take advantage of local hydrology to basically kind of have these at places where water funnels through pinch points in catchments, and then they can act as a nice filter for nutrients in specific locations, and we can find those locations and look to deploy them in optimal places. So the real positives of engineered log jams, you know, we've got potentially quite a lot of opportunities to do them. They don't require a huge amount of land. You know, the main land take is going to be that there will be a bit of loss of land on the floodplain around a sort of engineered log jam site, but they don't require huge amounts of land, and they can potentially yield quite a good amount of mitigation if you put them in the right place. And again, there will be supporting guidance coming on these from Natural England later this year. Some of the negatives associated with engineered log jams, we're kind of relying on a lot of work to do with what beavers do in the environment in terms of setting the efficiency estimates that I mentioned previously that we'll need for schemes like log jams and riparian buffers. That evidence base suggests that they can be effective, but it doesn't necessarily allow for really high efficiency estimates. So that kind of means that we do have to, you know, we won't be able to say that these schemes will be able to take lots of the kind of incoming nutrient load that goes into them out of the environment. But that should hopefully be made up for by the fact that they're kind of low tech, pretty cheap to deploy, and you've got lots of opportunities to do them. We will obviously be altering river channels in doing these schemes. That's got some associated considerations. Now, most of these schemes should be introducing kind of changes to river channels that should be net positive in terms of impacts on other things you need to think about, like hydrology, hydromorphology, ecology. But that will require some consideration and need to be part of the feasibility assessments. And it can also be that the sort of hydrology of a catchment area can play into your favour, but hydrology is a fickle master when it comes to looking at these schemes, and it can also end up limiting feasibility if you're not having the right places to deploy a scheme like a log jam on a land holding. So the next scheme that we're type of scheme that we're looking to deploy is what we call drainage ditch management. This is another one of our nature-based solutions that is quite similar to the previous solution, engineered log jams. Effectively, what we're looking to do is manage agricultural drainage ditches, store water within the agricultural landscape, and again, promote those processes that trap and cycle nutrients. lots of agricultural landscapes drained, so we've got lots of opportunities for deployment around affected catchment areas. And again, these are very similar in the way they function to engineered log jams in terms of the overarching principles. So we're again looking to take advantage of local hydrology and sort of find places where we can trap lots of water within the environment to generate a decent amount of mitigation. So again, we've got very similar benefits. Those who read the last slide will see that the benefits are basically all the same as they are for engineered log jams. Good amounts of mitigation, put them in the right places, relatively low land take, and again, there is a supporting guidance that's forthcoming from Natural England on these measures. Similarly, the evidence base doesn't allow for high efficiency estimates. Part of that is because there's not a huge amount of evidence from UK studies, but there is a significant amount of evidence, particularly from American studies, on using this kind of approach as an agricultural best management practice. So we think there is enough of an evidence base behind this approach to say it's something that we can use, and we think because it is a kind of quick, fairly easy, low-tech solution that can be deployed without taking up lots of land, then it's a really good one that's definitely worth looking at. One of the considerations here is obviously drainage ditches have been put in to manage field drainage, and we would effectively be reducing field drainage within agricultural land, which could have an impact on the ability for farmers to kind of grow crops, because the fields might get a bit wetter in certain places. Obviously, that's just, again, part of the feasibility assessments that would need to consider these factors to make sure they work for all of the parties that are going to be involved in deploying these schemes. So those kind of 4 measures that I've just been through are sort of our A list for what we're looking to deploy. We think they give a really great range of opportunities where we can hopefully find lots of places we can go and deploy them, and they kind of range, from being able to do big strategic schemes and the kind of treatment wetland side of things, through to a whole sort of suite of different measures that are pretty cheap and easy and quick to deploy, that can generate probably collectively a decent amount of mitigation if you can find a lot of locations around the landscape to deploy them. We also have some things which we are not looking at, but which we're aware have been looked at quite widely by other practitioners who are kind of looking at mitigation solutions. Probably the one that's been done the most is agricultural land abandonment, where people are sort of taking land out of food production, which stops nutrient inputs, and subsequently that acts as a mitigation scheme. There's various reasons we're not looking at this. One, particularly in phosphorus affected catchments, is that it's not economically viable to do this phosphorus at scale. You just don't get enough phosphorus coming from a sort of hectare of your average farmland relative to the amount that you get from new development to really mean you can do this viably without having to effectively stop farming in most of the catchments that are affected by phosphorus across the UK. But we also think, this is not good for local economies. You're probably going to be putting some farmers out of business in doing this, taking this kind of approach. And obviously, now more than ever, food security is a really big issue. We don't really think that stopping sort of taking areas out of food production in order to build houses is a particularly sensible way of using our land. It's also really not particularly cost efficient as well. The other measure that we wanted to raise that we aren't really supporting is what are termed online wetlands. So these are different to the treatment wetlands that I discussed previously. These are wetlands where you take water out of a river, run it through a wetland system and to remove some of the nitrogen and phosphorus from it, and then discharge it back to a river. The reason we don't really look at these solutions is they tend to actually be quite low yield, because, as I mentioned previously, your best setup for a wetland for generating nutrient mitigation is to have a high input source of nutrients going into the wetland. And most rivers, although they have problems with nutrients, the sort of relative concentrations in the rivers are not quite high enough to give you what we would sort of class as a high nutrient source. They're nowhere near as high as kind of what you get in treated effluent discharges from sewage treatment works that don't have nutrient stripping, or from kind of concentrated agricultural runoff or industrial processes that generate nutrient outputs. So because of that, you don't tend to get a massive amount of a sort of particularly big yield from these schemes. You're also looking at having to abstract water from a river, put it through a wetland and discharge it again, which means you're going to have to probably go through quite a complex process of potentially getting abstraction licenses, and then having a discharge permit, having to consider all the potential environmental impacts of taking water out of a river, which is something the Environment Agency and Natural England really aren't actually particularly that keen on, depleting a section of river of water and then putting it back in again slightly downstream. So there's various things that you'd have to, various barriers you'd have to get hurdle that make these schemes quite complex and actually quite expensive. And because they don't tend to yield a huge amount of mitigation, and they cost quite a lot, they don't have a particularly good cost benefit ratio. So yeah, we're not really looking at online wetlands as a solution that we would recommend. Finally, just a few other honourable mentions for things that I know have been getting some kind of support generally in other sectors or in other areas of the sector. Septic tank replacements and replacing them with package treatment plants. It was actually a question we had in the people that submitted questions prior to the webinar, whether or not this is viable. Yes, I think it works very well in theory. It's quite easy to evidence what the impact of replacing an old septic tank with a newer package treatment plant would be, or alternatively connecting a house that's on a septic tank to the mains. But I think that the sort of bigger barriers here are around implementation, who's going to look after it in the long term, and kind of having the long-term maintenance agreements that are required to show nutrient neutrality and perpetuity. There are also various other kind of site-specific feasibility questions that need to be answered that mean that not every single septic tank can be replaced with a package treatment plant to generate nutrient mitigation. But in general, yes, I think it's a good solution. And particularly, we think it probably is the kind of thing that works quite well for smaller developments. So when you're kind of building, sort of 1, 2, 10 houses, maybe, you might be able to do like a septic tank replacement scheme that would generate enough of an offset to sort of support that kind of number of houses, and is probably quite a lot cheaper than having to go down the kind of route of a bigger scheme involving having to purchase land and kind of using the previous nature-based solutions that I mentioned before. Short rotation coppice is another one you mentioned a few times. It's got quite a lot of potential in terms of decent amounts of support in the literature and a kind of logical mechanism for how it would take nutrients out of the environment. But you do need to constantly and consistently irrigate it with a high nutrient water source in order for it to continue providing nutrient mitigation in the long term, which is something that would have to be considered. And then SUDS is obviously something that I think we've got a lot of people from the development sector on this webinar. We're very aware that you're probably all going to have drainage designs for your sites that may include some kind of SUDS, and it's definitely worth seeing whether or not those SUDS can deliver nutrient mitigation. There has been some recent guidance from Syria that's now enabling putting some values to what SUDS can deliver for phosphorus. Anyway, there hasn't been any guidance for nitrogen yet, but I think that's forthcoming later in the year as well. Obviously, not all drainage designs will facilitate putting in the types of SUDS features that will generate nutrient mitigation or generate nutrient removal, but it's definitely worth seeing, speaking to the drainage designers for your sites and seeing whether or not they can have a look at this Syria guidance and see what they can do in terms of making the most of the SUDS designs that you've already got in place. So that was a kind of fairly rapid canter through all of the different types of measures that we're looking at promoting for nutrient mitigation, and obviously a couple of the ones that we don't really think are worth as much time. We're now going to have our first poll question, so I believe Kim is going to make that live in just 1 second. So yeah, we'll take a minute if you could have a look at the poll and respond, and then we'll have a quick talk through the answers. Okay, so the poll's just been closed. We'll have a look at the responses here. So in terms of the first question, what's your response to the nutrient neutrality issue? So interestingly, we've got kind of quite an even split, those on the call that are deploying their own mitigation schemes and kind of waiting for credits to come available. Thankfully, actually, I think I'm quite pleased that there aren't too many people who are kind of just hoping that the government makes it go away. But yeah, based on I think everything we've been seeing in terms of what's come out in the budget yesterday and broadly other government responses, it does feel like they're kind of not trying to get rid of the issue like Liz Truss was doing or threatening to do last year, and that it's now something that we're kind of looking at responding to rather than removing completely. And in terms of the second question, that doesn't massively surprise me, to be honest. I think, yeah, there are not, this is still a very new area, and we're not seeing kind of lots of examples of successfully deployed mitigation schemes. But I think, you know, we're moving forward with various of our own schemes. And I've been involved in a couple of successful ones. And so, yeah, we will start seeing more of those successful ones come to fruition, I'm sure, particularly over the next year, as more people start getting schemes in the ground. So, moving on to, you know, having discussed the types of solutions that we think are worth backing, we then need to think about how we can actually find opportunities to deploy mitigation solutions. So the first thing I wanted to touch on with this is previously mentioned, you know, we think that treatment wetlands, if we're going to go for wetlands, are the way forward. And for treatment wetlands, we want to find good input sources of you know, high concentration nutrients. And one of the best sources of those are wastewater discharges. So we, using available data sources, have mapped all of the wastewater discharges within all of the affected areas in England and Wales. And so that kind of, you know, is a really good starting point to say, well, you know, we know there are all these points where there is probably a treated wastewater discharge that's going to be an elevated source of nutrients. Seems like a good starting point. And we're in the process of working with landowners coming to us where they've got kind of bits of land that are next to these wastewater treatment works to see whether or not we can move forward with sort of the next steps of feasibility of whether or not actually, you know, there's wastewater treatment works there and a wastewater discharge. Can that be used to potentially create a wetland that would be a good source of mitigation? Another piece of work we've done is using available data sources. We're able to kind of create a very high level estimate of the potential mitigation that a wetland at a site could deliver. Now, I want to caveat that these are, you know, very high level estimates. The design process will refine these down, and these are probably more kind of, you know, we're talking ballpark figures of what we think we could generate from a wetland at any of these locations. But it's a useful initial screening exercise because it will tell us, you know, if we don't have the data that's available to begin to make one of these estimates, then that's kind of an interesting initial starting point to know what we might need to understand about each of these wetland sites, and then also we can kind of, you know, start discounting ones where we think it's not going to generate enough mitigation to warrant further investigation based on the kind of high level characteristics that the site has. As I mentioned previously, the tower technically achievable limits upgrades that are required under the levelling up, that may be required under the levelling up, but assuming it passes, will have quite a big impact on wetland viability at some of these sites. So this is all based on you know, how things stand at the moment, but quite a lot of these sites might end up being required to be upgraded if levelling up passes as is. And that would potentially limit the opportunities for wetland creation. So again, yeah, so it's something to bear in mind as we move forward. In terms of the other types of solutions, so all of these kind of mentioned previously, the riparian buffers, the engineered log jams, and the drainage ditch management solutions, we've got a kind of well-established playbook now for how to go about assessing these schemes and the potential that they can generate in an initial site screening methodology. So the yellow outline on the left of these images is a kind of larger catchment. This is an example from a live project we've got at the moment. We're working for a developer and a landowner to potentially bring this scheme forward. And we have got, as you can see, the kind of yellow outline is like a larger water body. So it's the catchment for this little stream running down here. And we need to figure out the area of this catchment that drains to a point where we think we can deploy some engineered log jam schemes, which is around here. So we've got a methodology that uses GIS to basically extract that catchment area, look at previous sort of available secondary data sources on land use that can give us an understanding of the land use over the past 5 years. We can use that to link the land use to the farm types that are really pivotal for understanding nutrient export, because that's what all the nutrient. So we've got these export coefficients that are in the nutrient budget calculators that can be used for understanding the amount of nutrients that come from different types of farming. And so we can use that basically by extracting all of those land uses, categorizing the types of farming within an area, which are the primary source of nutrients going into this scheme, and then use that to calculate the total nutrient export for an estimate of the total nutrient export for the area, and then use that combined with the efficiency estimates, as mentioned previously. We've got this ability using literature to set efficiency estimates of what we think these schemes can deliver. Effectively, and reduce the export that we calculated potentially going into this by your efficiency of the scheme, and that gives you a potential mitigation estimate. And for this scheme here, as I said, you can take advantage of local hydrology in order to, hopefully have schemes where you can do something relatively targeted that will take advantage of sort of potential nutrient sources from around this whole catchment area. And as a consequence, we think that this scheme has a potential to generate somewhere in the region of 109 kilos of phosphorus mitigation in this affected catchment area. So yeah, we're this is a really great example of how one of these schemes can actually generate a kind of meaningful amount of phosphorus mitigation or nitrogen mitigation if you put it in the right place. So we can do this exercise pretty quickly in terms of screening these sites and getting to the point where we can go through here, using secondary data sources, extracting catchment areas and doing all this categorization of land use. But that's not the kind of only story, that's only the beginning really of what we need to do in terms of understanding the potential feasibility of these schemes. And there's a lot more, this is a kind of nice starting point and it tells us whether or not it's worth pursuing something further, but there's a lot more in terms of feasibility that has to be looked at in order to make sure that we're not going to effectively specify a scheme that kind of other environmental factors basically means won't work. So we can use a whole load of other freely available data sources to work through a set of kind of other feasibility screening tests to make sure that these locations are actually going to be worth pursuing. And what we've got here, so we've got a better rainfall map. So a lot of the rainfall mapping that people are using is kind of the stuff that is available in online, that there's links in the nutrient budget calculators that people are sort of going to basically sort of surf around on a map and click a location. And we've compiled our own rainfall map using the same data sets in there, but that are more up to date and enable us to more kind of robustly query the amount of rainfall that's going into these catchments. There's also data available on soil phosphorus and also soil nitrogen, but there would have been too many maps that haven't included soil nitrogen here. And also this is a phosphorus only catchment, so it's not as important here. But there is data sets on soil phosphorus concentrations, which we can use just as a kind of, again, a bit of a screening tool to say, okay, we think that there might actually be a decent amount of soil phosphorus in this catchment, which means that we're probably going to have a better chance of having a good mitigation solution. Again, these are big kind of national scale mapping data sets that they're not huge, they're not massively accurate necessarily, but they give us a good opportunity to just filter in and say, okay, these sites are beginning to tick a lot of boxes in terms of feasibility. We'll have to recognize the kind of inaccuracies in the sort of national scale mapping approaches, but they are really, really good at this kind of screening stage. Similarly, there's kind of national scale mapping on the percentage of different types of soil, so clay and silt, sand, and that has a big impact on how catchments operate. So this little catchment area we're looking at here that's outlined, that has, as you can see, a relatively high proportion of clay in its soil. That will help to promote some of the processes, sort of the hydrological processes that would mean this is actually a decent location for a scheme. I won't go into technical details of why here, but this is kind of how we can look at this information again to zero in on places that are genuinely good for deploying these schemes. There are other soil data sets. As I said, we're looking at this kind of national mapping. There's obviously inaccuracies in this kind of mapping at this kind of scale, but there's multiple data sets we can use. And there's another soil data set that again shows that this area is a sort of clayey, silty soil. The topsoil composition data set, this one, there's a percentage silt one, and it's about 30% silt as well. So that shows that these two data sets corroborate each other, which is nice. Again, this is all kind of building a picture of a sort of large amount of certainty that this is going to be going into a decent location. And we can look at the geology as well, which again helps with kind of understanding whether or not there are any of these factors that might basically mean that sort of the site doesn't function particularly well as a nutrient mitigation solution. So yeah, we've got a really good ability to bring all this information together, give us a good understanding right from the get-go of whether or not we think it's worth pursuing a scheme further. And if we do, then it's moving on to the next stage, which is looking at the land acquisition process. So when we're looking at this land acquisition process on behalf of the developer, as I said, we're kind of doing two separate strands to the work that we're doing: Greenshank environmental, site-specific mitigation strategies for developers, and bringing our own schemes forward. And the where we're looking to work for developers, we're really conscious that landowners will see the value in these kind of schemes, and if we've only got one option, then that can end up meaning that the scheme could be potentially very expensive for a developer. So we would look to sort of progress multiple sites simultaneously to create a competitive tension between landowners, to basically mean that the prices for land don't get driven up massively. We're also seeing a lot from the kind of experiences I've had from speaking to landowners and developers, that landowners don't want to sell their land for these schemes, and also developers don't want to buy the land because they don't want to end up having a kind of really weird asset portfolio of just bizarre bits of land, tiny bits of land next to drainage ditches and rivers around catchments. Like, it's not useful for them to have that on their books. So we're operating a sort of try not to buy principle, where we get agreement to deploy the scheme. We have legal agreements in place that basically covenant the landowners to have the scheme in place for the 80+ year period, but the landowner doesn't actually sell the land. And we've had some really good kind of feedback from landowners and developers in terms of that approach. And of course, the landowner would be remunerated for kind of giving up that land without actually having to sell either the freehold or a leasehold on the land. We really think it's massively important to get that agreement in principle with a landowner, with some kind of legal basis behind it before we move forward with any scheme. Without that, it's just too speculative, and it de-risks, massively the next stages. If we know that the kind of landowner has at least signed something that says, they would agree to kind of move forward with the next steps in terms of deploying the solution, and that means we can take the scheme forward to Natural England and the LPA in terms of the next stages of getting the scheme deployed. We're going to talk about those next steps in terms of getting schemes deployed in a second, but next up we've got a second poll question. So I'm just going to move to that, and Kim will make that poll live now. Okay, so it's quite an interesting response there, actually. Again, it probably doesn't surprise me too much. We are really aware that there aren't too many regions around the country where there are kind of mitigation solutions that are readily being offered for sale. Obviously, the Solent is kind of one of the key ones that now has a kind of more functioning credit market, but actually that is pretty much the only region in the country that we're aware of that has a kind of functioning mitigation market with lots of people offering credits for sale. So yeah, that's quite instructive that, you know, there's a lot of work really that needs to be done here to kind of bring these solutions forward and to facilitate, I think, the government's objectives of having a kind of market-based approach, particularly in England anyway, to dealing with this issue. So kind of talk through how we can find sites, and how once we found a site, you know, we need to get to a certain point with the land acquisition process in order to facilitate us taking that site forward for the next steps to getting a scheme actually deployed. So when we're moving towards deployment, you know, the kind of most pivotal, well, one of the most pivotal early stages is that we would engage with Natural England and local planning authority and potentially Environment Agency. I've included them here. They don't always need to be engaged on all of these schemes, but they will need to be engaged on some of them, because we're really conscious that, you know, these schemes will sink or swim on Natural England approval and also local planning authority buy-in. So we want to make sure that we get that engagement process started early. We're also aware that, you know, Natural England are incredibly resource constrained. They can take time to respond to the kind of engagement process you need to go through, and probably, you know, most situations using discretionary advice service. And yeah, we want to get that started early, because it can be something that would potentially hold up a project down the line if we wait too long. We would aim in the first instance to get agreement in principle to the kind of outline design for a scheme. If Natural England buy into the kind of outline design for the scheme, then, you know, we're really hopeful that means we'll have a lot of support in terms of being able to take the scheme forward. Again, local planning authorities, we want to make sure we're aware that they will quite often, you know, work with Natural England and kind of steer from Natural England on the kind of technicalities of the scheme, but they might have their own possible reasons to object to schemes, and we also want to make sure early doors that isn't something that might end up hampering a scheme down the line. There was a question actually that came in prior to the webinar about whether or not a scheme can be deployed in an area, because, you know, in one local planning authority's administrative area and serve a development in another local planning authority's administrative area. We've seen this happen, I think, in the Solent region. There are schemes happening in some areas that are being used by people who are in the area of a different local planning authority. I think there shouldn't really be any reason why the LPA would kind of object to that. So that shouldn't be a barrier towards getting schemes deployed in kind of anywhere that serves a development. Natural England place some specific geographical requirements on schemes that are outlined in their nutrient neutrality principles. The kind of main thing is, from that perspective, is that the nutrients need to be taken out of the system. So if you're on a river, if it's a river affected river, for example, your development will put nutrients in at a point at on the river, and your mitigation scheme basically just has to have taken the nutrients out before your development puts them back in again, so somewhere further upstream, effectively, and that's kind of the key geographical constraint. Which does mean there is a requirement. So one of the other questions, I think, that came in prior to the webinar was about whether or not mitigation solutions have to be within the affected catchment areas, and yes, they do, but they shouldn't necessarily have to be within the boundaries of one of the LPAs within that catchment area, because obviously, you know, catchments don't adhere to LPA boundaries. So yeah, once we've got once we've got kind of agreement in principle from the key stakeholders, we would then move on to a formal agreement with the landowner, which would obviously secure the site for the next stages in terms of developing and deploying a scheme. We would then move through a whole set of detailed design and feasibility studies that would make sure that there aren't going to be any significant showstoppers that would basically mean that we can't progress the project forward to implementation. And once we have got through all of those, that implementation, once we've got through all the detailed feasibility and design work, assuming that we haven't had anything go wrong at this stage, and we're looking at a scheme that's viable, everyone's happy with, and we're moving forward, then there's going to be a set of required kind of implementation steps. One thing that's going to be really key with these schemes is legal agreements. So yeah, we're going to have robust legal agreements in place that secure delivery of the scheme, for one. So previously mentioned that we'd look to not actually purchase land associated with these schemes, but have legal agreements in place and kind of covenant landowners to deploy the schemes. Alternatively, if we do need to buy the land, we will kind of work to buy land as well. So there will just be effectively a legal agreement in place that says that the land that's being used for the scheme is secured for 80+ years for that purpose. We'll also obviously need a link to the planning system, which is potentially likely in most cases going to come through Section 106 agreements. And so there is this whole legal kind of framework around what needs to be delivered, and there will also be probably a link to the maintenance and monitoring requirements as well that will have to be in those legal documents that support any scheme. We also know so this is kind of a requirement that's stipulated in the Natural England's wetland guidance. There's a framework basically in that guidance document for how to deploy those schemes, and the same framework is kind of been applied for the other types of solutions that we're backing. As I said previously, it's going to have a guidance document coming out at some point later in the year. There's an implementation plan that will be required in that framework that basically shows, that you are going to do this in the right way, and that basically the whole, delivering the scheme as designed is actually credible. And then there'll also need to be a set of maintenance and monitoring plans. So, effectively, Natural England and the local planning authorities will want to have the confidence that the scheme is going to be maintained in a way that it continues to function and continues to deliver nutrient mitigation in a way that it was kind of originally proposed, effectively. So that's, again, really, really important in terms of showing that the whole thing is going to deliver for that in perpetuity period. And as I mentioned before, it's likely that the legal agreements will make reference to how the maintenance in particular of the scheme is set up, and how money is being basically put aside for those to cover those costs in the long term, because obviously we are talking about long periods of time over which these schemes need to be maintained and managed for. And finally, we'll get to the point of sign off and deployment. All of the work that I've kind of talked through, previously, will generate a whole kind of pack of information, supporting documents that will form, a submission to Natural England. We'll go back to them with and say, okay, we've done all of this. We think we've covered all of the work you need us to do to show that the scheme is secured, it's feasible, it's going to take nutrients out of the environment, function the way it needs to, it's going to be maintained in the long term. And ultimately, it's this kind of supporting documentation that will probably sit behind an HRA that uses uses the scheme to link to a planning application. And once we get agreement from Natural England and the LPA on the scheme, we can then do the deployment work and actually get the kind of spades in the ground to deliver whatever the solution is. So once we kind of get to the spades in the ground point, the land management approaches, so riparian buffers, log jams, and drainage ditch management, sort of probably looking at around a 1 month delivery time. It could be quicker than that if it's quite a sort of small localized scheme. It may take a bit longer than that if it's a really, really big scheme across a large area. But yeah, I think 1 month is probably about right on average. And with wetland construction, kind of looking at more like sort of 3 to 6 months from the point where you sort of break ground on a wetland site. So yeah, so that's kind of a run through of how we are approaching delivering nutrient mitigation solutions. Hope that's been kind of useful to the audience. I know you can see that we've had quite a few questions coming in, so we'll move on to the Q&A now. Kim, I know you've been keeping an eye on the questions. Are there any particularly sort of pertinent ones that have been upvoted, or
Yeah, so I've just rearranged them by the number of upvotes. So what kind of mitigation measures can be used on residential schemes where space is limited and there are no credit schemes? Most popular.
So we're talking about on-site solutions.
It does sound like that, yeah.
Yeah. So really, the kind of main on-site solutions are using SUDs. There's been some talk about using package treatment plants on site. It's something that I'm never really entirely sure of the technical viability of it. It's a bit of a watch this space question at the moment. In Wales, where there's been actually a bit of a departure from what's happening in England, they are talking about, and there is going to be some guidance forthcoming from Welsh Government about how package treatment plants can be used as an interim measure, connecting into, so putting a package treatment plant on a development before it connects into the mains to basically reduce the amount of phosphorus or nitrogen that's discharging into the mains, which kind of reduces the amount that's coming from development. It doesn't actually kind of get you to neutrality. I don't entirely know how they're kind of going to square that circle, and it'll be interesting to see what the logic is behind how they're used in Wales and if that has any impact in England. We know Welsh Water have agreed to adopt them temporarily, at least, I think, or have agreed to enable them anyway to discharge into the foul sewer system, which is a big sort of sticking point in England. I think a lot of water companies haven't agreed to that, and they don't necessarily like to have water coming from package treatment plants into the foul sewer system because it can change chemistry a bit and have impacts on their treatment processes. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of questions around the viability or validity of using package treatment plants on site, but watch this space in Wales and it might filter over to England. The other main solution is basically just using a really good SUDS design. As mentioned previously, there is this recent guidance from Syria that will at least give you an ability to basically quantify what a SUDS design can remove for phosphorus, and therefore, yeah, and subsequently, that's probably the kind of best way that you can look at generating mitigation on site. It isn't going to completely remove the need for, it's unlikely to completely remove the need for offsite mitigation, effectively, because you are probably going to, you won't, it's hard to reach neutrality using on-site solutions. The SUDS won't get you to neutrality because there's still this residual amount of nutrients that comes from sewage that is just additional in most situations anyway. So yeah, it can play a part, but probably won't actually achieve it. It's quite hard to achieve neutrality apart from potentially on quite small sites.
Good stuff. Next question. How much nitrogen phosphorus removal can you get from a log jam or riparian buffer strip? Sorry, how do you measure how much nitrogen or phosphorus removal you get from a log jam or riparian buffer strip? Farm scoper data can provide land use coefficients when calculating land fallowing mitigation. Do similar coefficients exist for log jams and riparian buffer strips? Do you need to carry?
Yeah, so effectively the approach that we're kind of taking and that we have previously discussed with Natural England and seen kind of others sort of proposing as well, is that you would effectively use agricultural export coefficients to calculate what comes from a catchment into a riparian buffer or a log jam or a drainage ditch kind of management area, and then you would use that to reduce the and then combine that with an efficiency estimate of what they will deliver in order to basically calculate what the offset that would be delivered from that scheme would be. We're very conscious that, this is quite a generalized approach to doing this. The ideal situation is that you'd go out and kind of monitor these schemes in advance and do a more kind of intensive process that would basically quantify through monitoring what the kind of potential input to these schemes would be. But effectively, if everyone was doing that, these things would actually just never happen, because it would take quite a long time. You'd need probably 6+ months lead-in time for a monitoring scheme. You'd then potentially have to have a really long period after monitoring it to see what it's delivering, and what we need is an ability to quantify kind of before the scheme's been put in place what it will deliver. And this is where kind of relying on the precautionary principle will be really important, because we're basically going to kind of take really precautionary estimates of what these schemes will deliver using this kind of approach of taking secondary data, which hopefully means that whilst we recognise there will be inaccuracies, we're hopefully kind of still underestimating what they're actually going to deliver in the real world. So it's an exercise using export coefficients, kind of the hydrology of a catchment, and sort of estimated efficiency of these schemes, and then going from there and seeing whether or not kind of Natural England agree once you've kind of gone through that process.
Good stuff. Next question. Can buffers and log jams be combined into the same project, and would they make a good interim proposal while catchments are restored through other actions, so the length of certainty deployment can be reduced?
Yes, I think, definitely. That there's a really interesting wider dynamic on this issue, that overall, there's always been an objective to restore all of these catchments to favourable conservation status, and at the moment, one of the things that's barring a lot of them from being in favourable conservation status is that they're failing nitrogen and phosphorus targets. So there is a whole wider set of programmes going on to kind of tackle the existing problem and help to bring the kind of overall concentration in the catchment down to below the target level. These measures, could potentially be used in that way, I think, in terms of, and it would be a probably slightly more robust way, because actually, we're going to put things in place to show that the scheme will be maintained for 80 years. We will rebuild log jams if we need to, if they're kind of breached by large floods. We'll effectively look to design a log jam scheme to be resistant to the 1 in 100 year, hopefully try and kind of be resistant to up to 1 in 100 year flood if that's possible. But that should kind of, in theory, tick the in perpetuity box, but we need to check the engineering feasibility of that on each individual scheme. And so if you can say, well, actually, we're going to design it to kind of be, resistant to a sort of slightly smaller return period flood, that then means you can kind of say, well, we'll then reassess, and if the scheme's still required, take it from there. There's a lot of sort of open questions, I think, about how this really is going to play out in terms of the in perpetuity requirements, because they are so long. But in theory, I think, you could try and make the argument. I think, again, it's probably one of those things that will just end up being tested with Natural England, because they've got, they've enshrined the in perpetuity period of 80 to 125 years in a lot of the guidance and principles around nutrient neutrality. So it might be that we just kind of have to adhere to that. But it's certainly a question I think it's worth asking.
Good stuff. Do you have any examples of SUDs which look to demonstrate some of the solutions you've mentioned?
So in terms of the types of SUDs features, the kind of things you're looking at is basically anything that will help to slow water down and keep it in contact with so slow water movement through a SUDS treatment train, and keep it in contact with soil and vegetation. So retention ponds, bioretention pits, swales, those kind of features, so tree pits, they're all kind of features that would potentially help to provide a mitigation benefit. Again, they have to be designed properly to ensure that retain water in them for long enough to support the processes that facilitate taking nutrients out of the environment. The Syria guidance I've mentioned a few times, I think that does contain links to the kind of standards, design standards for individual treatment features. So I'd really say go and have a look at that and have a look at all of the measures that are sort of stated in there that have efficiency values associated with them. And that's a really good sort of new reference for how SUDs can basically be used to provide nutrient mitigation.
Good stuff. Can you deploy treatment wetlands on a small scale?
Yeah, you can. So in fact, some examples that are live at the moment that weren't done for nutrient neutrality purposes and are actually outside the Norfolk Broads catchment, but they're really good kind of test cases for using wetlands on the end of small wastewater treatment works that are in Norfolk, have been done by the Norfolk Rivers Trust and are kind of flagship projects that Anglian Water have promoted. One of them is I think has a footprint of less than a hectare and is I think generating like over 100 kilos of sort of phosphorus removal per year. They're actually quite interesting examples, these two, because I think I'm looking at the data on them previously, and I think there's a bigger one that's actually generating less mitigation than the smaller one because of the nature of the discharge going into it, which really highlights the benefit of having a high concentration source and trying to find those high concentration sources of nutrients. So yeah, they can be done on small scales. And then actually that's probably the best thing to try and do, is to try and target those treatment works where they're quite small. You're not going to have a big area, and they've got quite a high concentration of nutrients coming out of them.
Okay. Have you considered addressing the source of the problem in catchments like the Wye, the overuse/misuse of fertilizers? There's a question mark. Regenerative farming. Clearly, there's no certain mitigation for conventional farming systems.
Yeah, I mean, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about the kind of efforts to tackle the impact, the existing impact that have all kind of been active in these catchments quite a long time. One of the problems when it comes to kind of using approaches that involve managing nutrient sort of sources from agricultural activities that basically involve trying to get the agricultural sector to change practices is that it's just very hard to secure. It would make a really, really big difference, but ultimately when you're looking at kind of having to ask somebody to do something rather than actually building something and putting it in the ground, it's much harder to check if the person is still doing that thing versus going and seeing whether or not a drainage ditch has still got a block in it and is vegetated. So kind of it's really a kind of question around monitoring and the ability to secure those approaches rather than whether or not they can work. We know they would work if we could get everyone to do them, and if we could get everyone to do them, this wouldn't be a problem necessarily. So yeah, that's kind of more the issue with those rather than being something that we shouldn't do, and it's kind of probably happening in a slightly different way as part of wider efforts to restore these catchments and deal with the underlying problem.
Okay. What sort of filter plants would you have in or near riparian buffers?
What kind of filter plants? I'm going to be a bit vague here and just say you just would want to have native plants for, you design it to have whatever the native species of the area that you're in is. I mean, one of the things obviously that you would also look with any of these schemes to deliver is biodiversity net gain. So ultimately you'd be looking to design a scheme that has the vegetation in it that you would want to see that would probably naturally be next to that river anyway. So, we're not saying one size fits all solution here. Just go and plant, I don't know, poplar trees along every river. We'd pick whatever's best suited, and it might not be trees as well. It might be that you want shrubs instead. Maybe that you kind of an area where trees wouldn't naturally grow. So yeah, whatever's best suited based on the native vegetation for that area. It's worth noting. Sorry, just the key thing is the vegetation, not necessarily what vegetation it is. With riparian buffers, a lot of the time it's kind of just having something there that's basically taking nutrients out of the sort of uptaking nutrients from the soil and creating a physical barrier that helps to deposit nutrients within the soil as well.
Are you able to use treatment wetlands adjacent to residential sites, and what kind of land taking looking at per kilo per year?
So if I've understood that question correctly, you could put a treatment wetland next to a residential site. I think the question is if there's a source of water to go into it that would warrant putting it next to a residential site. So you could have a wetland as part of a SUDS design, but that would have probably one of the sort of bigger impacts in terms of taking nutrients out of the surface water runoff from the site, but that's kind of a slightly different thing. In terms of having treatment wetlands, like I said, you want these like high input sources of nutrients going into them, and so it would more be that is the development site next to a farm that has a farmyard that has a good place to deploy a treatment wetland, or a wastewater treatment works would be a good place to deploy a treatment wetland, and then they might be next to each other, but probably wouldn't like sort of build a treatment wetland next to a development site as part of the development, if that makes sense.
Yep. In the Y/Lug, it appears we can't rely on TAL as we are a Welsh operator. Other issues are that our sewage treatment works are almost all under 2,000 people. The Natural England EA say TAL won't be used to help as much with our phosphorus load as it's primary agricultural. Is it best for us to still keep wetlands as our primary focus for housing mitigation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Y catchment is a good example of you've got a lot of treatment works that are under 2,000 people, and those ones are really good candidates for deploying wetlands at. Welsh Water have actually recently released some guidance on collaboration opportunities. They've done a kind of big exercise. To look at where they might be able to have opportunities where they're not going to be doing upgrades because they're not being affected by the levelling up bill, and so they would potentially be able to provide a bit more steer on where they would support wetland opportunities at treatment works in the Y catchment. And obviously the Herefordshire Council have got the first phosphate treatment wetland in the country agreed in that catchment. It's phosphate treatment wetland for nutrient neutrality purposes. There's obviously a lot of agriculture in the catchment as well, so a lot of these other measures we talked about in terms of riparian buffers, logjam schemes, and drainage ditch management will potentially have a good kind of opportunity there as well, to do things within the agricultural landscape that aren't necessarily wetlands, because obviously there's just some limitations to deploying wetlands.
Good stuff. We're actually at time, but I think it's fair to say we're happy to continue answering questions. But for those that do have to join us, just a big thank you for joining. Brings us up to the next question. What's the current legal position with non-wetlands nature-based solutions? There are examples of valid credits being generated by such schemes already, or still in a watch this space territory.
Sorry, can you repeat that question, Kim?
What's the current legal position with non-wetland nature-based solutions, i.e. riparian buffers, so on, and are there examples of valid credits being generated?
I think at the moment it's still very early stage. I'm aware that Natural England kind of basically sort of signing off on the approaches to generating these credits using these schemes, and so there aren't, I think, any sort of active schemes that people are trading credits using riparian buffers, all the other kind of measures that we mentioned before. But as I said previously, I led the project up until I left my previous role, which was basically generating the guidance where these kind of measures are going to be recommended as nutrient mitigation solutions. So we're pretty confident that they will, have the backing of Natural England. From a kind of legal perspective, again, as I said, sort of mentioned previously, we need to see, if we can get agreement from Natural England on the technical elements of these schemes, then it's about securing how those technical elements are delivered, and there will be a set of legal agreements that are going to be required to underpin those. But effectively, I suppose, looking at, for example, what's going on in the Solent, where a lot of the solutions are kind of people taking agricultural land out of production, and there is one, maybe two, I think, examples now of wetlands as well. One in is a sort of agricultural wetland that's like taking lots of runoff from surrounding agricultural land. those are all schemes that are functioning where people have got the required legal agreements behind them to basically say that the scheme is going to be continually delivered. And so there is a kind of bit of precedent there that says effectively if you specify something in the way that you say it's going to be done, that needs to be done, and then say it's going to be delivered for the time it needs to be delivered for, we should have the kind of confidence that that we won't have any kind of legal barriers really to sort of generating nutrient mitigation using these new methods that we've talked about today.
So, how would the types of mitigation schemes you've suggested be secured in relation to specific planning applications requiring such mitigation?
So we think that in most cases it's going to be via sort of Section 106 agreements. In terms of how we've kind of seen things done previously, like it sort of probably depends on the nature of the scheme. We're aware that like sort of bigger strategic schemes that are selling credits are generally using Section sort of they're being done by private providers, I think, have underlying Section 106 agreements. We know that Havant Borough Council, as an example, had brought forward one of the first sort of strategic schemes in the country, Warblington Farm, where they took a farm that they owned and took it out of agricultural production to generate nitrogen mitigation. They, as the local planning authority, then created a unilateral undertaking under Section 106 that was just a kind of, blanket legal agreement that said this links, sign this and it links your planning application to this scheme. So those are likely to be the kind of main mechanisms. Obviously, conservation covenants is the other thing that is obviously not kind of, it's still very fledgling in terms of how these are going to work, and we're aware that they simply haven't really been used yet, but that's also another kind of legal mechanism where we think there might be the ability to use that to link to the responsible body, which could be a planning authority, and have that sort of feed into how it's all linked to the planning process. But yeah, those are the sort of options that we know are being used. We imagine it will likely be Section 106 agreements.
So, next question. This has partially been answered, but what's the scope to overlap BNG, nutrient neutrality, and SUDS design? Schedule 3.
Yeah, so there's recently been an outcome from the consultation on BNG, which has thankfully said that this kind of stacking question, can you do BNG and nutrient neutrality with the same scheme, has now been answered as yes, you can, which is great, because it doesn't mean you need to have sort of double the amount of land. And yeah, I mean, I think ultimately with the SUDS design, if it offers BNG and nutrient benefits, I think those can be claimed from the SUDS design as long as it's all designed correctly, and you do the BNG metric properly, and quantify the nutrient removal benefits it could deliver.
Good stuff. Similar to another question, but for the mitigation scheme / assessments methodology slide, presumably those numbers in kilos were reflecting a particular balance of land use within the test area. But is it possible to give a broad guide of relative land use impacts, e.g. cereal growing versus grazing, please?
Unfortunately, not really, no. This is where, there is a lot of technical complexity in doing these assessments. The output from a cereals farm, based on the kind of, the export coefficients that we use that come from this farm scope model, are massively dependent on the rainfall and soil type on a site, and they can vary by an order of magnitude as a consequence of that. So it's quite difficult to kind of give an average value to this kind of thing. We sort of try not to do that because we don't think it kind of really is that reflective of what happens on the ground. So there really is a need to kind of look at this assessment on a site-by-site basis. But as I said, we've kind of got this methodology now that means we can do it pretty quickly. So
good. I've struggled to find solutions for self-build single-dwelling clients. What solutions would Greenshank provide for such developments? Yeah,
there is a real kind of black spot here for these smaller developments. We're really conscious that to deploy the kind of bigger solutions that we're looking at, the stuff that we talked about, even sort of drainage ditch management schemes and stuff, there's going to be some land costs involved and quite a lot of technical assessments. And the reality is, like, probably the cheapest scheme you're looking at is going to come in kind of close to 100 grand in total costs when you add in all the legals and everything as well, which obviously, you know, for sort of smaller developments just isn't going to be financially viable. So I think the kind of one of the main potential options that those kind of smaller developers can do without, you know, necessarily just having to wait for sort of credits to become available is to look at those septic tank and package treatment plant replacement schemes. As I said previously, you know, they're really easy to quantify what they would deliver in terms of nutrient mitigation benefit. You kind of pass all of the technical stuff on that side of things in Natural England quite in a quite straightforward manner, assuming that there are, as I said, there are these other kind of feasibility questions around environmental constraints that do need to be considered. But assuming you've got one in the right location, you know, you can evidence what it's going to deliver, what the sort of change is going to deliver pretty easily. You're then kind of in this thing about having to figure out how to secure maintenance in the long term, but I think there probably are ways around that. And ultimately, you know, doing a replacement scheme like that is probably going to cost in at somewhere where you could feasibly do it as a small self-builder. You know, be a bit of a hit, but it's not the kind of level of one of these other bigger sort of land management type schemes.
Good stuff. Just in addition to that, we are also bringing schemes of our own to bear. So we will have credits available. So if you do want to let us know where your schemes are at some point in the future, we'll hopefully be able to help out. I think just in addition to that, if there are kind of smaller developers where there are maybe 20 or so units, we can often look at doing consortium approaches and bringing a single solution for multiple developers. So that's also an option. Next question. I presume you'll have to undertake flood risk assessment and impound and licensing for log jams.
So we will. Obviously, flood risk assessments are going to be needed for all of these schemes. They're all involving, doing things that impact hydrology in rivers, and so we're going to have to do some kind of flood risk assessment. I'm fairly confident that in most situations, we're doing this in like really rural environments where there's, you know, we're kind of basically going to flood some land that's probably already on a floodplain. And increase potentially the kind of scale of flooding in those areas with the agreement of the landowner, and there shouldn't really be any sort of anything at flood risk within the areas that we'd be looking to deploy the solutions. But yes, it will be, you know, that was when I mentioned about EA engagement. Like, there's probably going to have to be some engagement with the Environment Agency on flood risk issues in a lot of these cases, but hopefully it's relatively straightforward in terms of not needing like really detailed flood risk assessments. Impoundment licenses, it's something we're aware of potentially needing. I think, you know, I can't remember exactly what the threshold is for the amount of the volume of water that you can't impound above before needing an impoundment license. We would, again, it's about the design of the scheme. If there's a risk that we will end up impounding that much water, we'd have to look at it, and it might be that becomes a feasibility problem for a scheme if it looks like it's going to impound too much water, and the licensing for that is going to be too difficult. But yeah, it's again part of the sort of feasibility assessment would obviously be to look at that.
Good stuff. There's a question about the example we gave. So the grazing having a potential of 100 kilos of phosphorus mitigation a year. Is that right?
Well, so that is basically that catchment area is pretty large. It drains to that little stream, and most of that area is grazed land. So using the export coefficients for grazing land and combining that with the potential percentage efficiency of the solution gave us a figure of about 100 kilos. So yeah, again, it's one of those things where we're doing this work, it will go to Natural England, they will check our sums, and I think it makes sense from what I know and have done, but yeah, it will obviously get checked off by the relevant authorities. So
good. What are your thoughts on agricultural land reversion, i.e. changing high input, high phosphorus input / high intensity use to no/low inputs? So could it still be used for food or agriculture, but with less phosphorus inputs? Any thoughts on strategic destocking in catchments with heavy livestock contributions? And legacy phosphorus issues are quite a big issue in the lug. So short rotation cropping / orchards might be worth looking at. Got a few questions there.
Yeah, so kind of on the destocking, changing, arable reversion to sort of lower intensity land use. I mean, again, that comes back to what I've said previously about, yes, in theory, works well, would have a great impact. It's about securing it in perpetuity when you're basically relying on practice change. I remember a colleague of mine who's a national HRA specialist, when we talked about examples of agricultural planning applications to do with kind of stocking numbers, basically said that what generally gets looked at in these situations is what the potential maximum amount of cattle that could be stocked is, because you just don't know whether or not somebody might then go up to that number, and it's difficult to enforce them not to. So again, like if there was a good enforcement mechanism to say, you've got the potential to have you've got the potential to have like a large high density stocking, but you're going to choose to have a lower one for nutrient benefit purposes. How do you then make sure that that's actually happening? I mean, the Environment Agency are woefully underfunded. Most people know that they don't go out and check this stuff on a regular basis in terms of enforcing agricultural regulations. So it just gets into this area where it's like pretty hard to show that it's going to remain effective. But yeah, in theory, yes, it could work. I think if we can figure out a mechanism of proving it in the long term, great, add it to the canon of measures. The question around legacy phosphorus and short rotation coppice, yes, definitely agree with that. It's a great idea for legacy phosphorus. I think this is where I mentioned about needing a sort of consistent source of kind of nutrient-rich water to irrigate it with, if you want a sort of long-term mitigation solution from it. But I think as a short-term mitigation solution, potentially bridging the gap to something more strategic coming online, short rotation coppice could be a really great solution in that sense, because yeah, you can plant it in an area that's got high soil phosphorus from legacy phosphorus inputs. It can then just take phosphorus out of the environment. You don't necessarily even need to put more fertilizer inputs in, and it binds up this phosphorus that would otherwise leach out over a period of time. So yeah, for that kind of purpose. But like I said, that you then reach a point where you are going to always reach a point where you need to put more in, because once it's used all the phosphorus is there, and it wants to keep growing, it will need more phosphorus. And that's where the switch to, okay, can you irrigate it with a high phosphorus source? That would then perhaps enable it to become a long-term solution, bearing in mind that the trees only last about 30 years anyway, so you'd have to replant them. But yeah, like there are kind of different things, probably short-term for legacy, more long-term if you can figure out some way of making that work with a high input source of irrigation.
Good stuff. At what point in the process will the landowner know and secure the value of their mitigation scheme?
So that would basically be, we would agree the credit, sort of the mitigation amount in the initial kind of in principle agreements with Natural England. So the first step will basically be to say, okay, we've done this sort of work that says, based on what we think is going into this, if we design a scheme that meets the principles that we need to meet in order for this to function as a nutrient mitigation scheme, do you agree it will basically take out the amount of nutrients that we're saying it will? If they agree to that, then we have the confidence to move forward with the rest of the kind of process in terms of land acquisition, design, feasibility, etc. And that means that we can then kind of have that ability to also look at the value of the scheme from the perspective of the landowner and perspective of the developer.
Good stuff. I'm a self-builder and I need to install a treatment plant as no mains drains. We also have a small meadow which leads to a stream. Could we use this as this land as a buffer? Yes, I think you probably could. As I said, you'd need to, it depends on the land use on the site. There's various factors that would play into it. But if you've got a sort of a meadow that's used for any kind of agricultural use, and then a stream that doesn't have a kind of buffer along it at the moment, then yeah, that could potentially work as a solution. Again, we'd have to look at it. All this stuff is site specific, but yeah, in theory, yes. So, is an HRA still required if nutrient neutrality on-site mitigation can be achieved and evidenced?
Yes, it will be. You'll need to show, the kind of default position. So the nutrient budget calculators that we use to quantify what amount of mitigation that you need will be part of the stage one. So HRA obviously has 2 stages. In the first stage, you're basically kind of saying, if I don't do anything, will my site potentially have an impact, have an adverse impact on the designated site that you're in the catchment of? If you calculate a nutrient budget and it comes up with a positive number, then the answer to that question is yes, and you then have to move on to the second stage, which is the kind of mitigation bit. So you would basically always have to do an HRA that shows that, if you've got a positive number, you're putting something in place to make that number, to neutralize that number. If the number's negative coming out of the nutrient budget calculations, you're in a good position, and you could kind of just stop there and say, we're not going to have any impact, but you still need to do that stage 1 HRA to get to that point in the first place.
Good stuff. What happens to all the mitigation schemes and agreements once catchments reach favourable conditions and are restored? The repair and long-term protection of the catchment should be a focus for the agency/authorities, but I'm worried that once a compliant management scheme is adopted to restore and protect the catchment to natural England satisfaction, there'll be no need for housing neutrality/mitigation.
It's a big open question. Yeah. I think, as I mentioned previously, like this in perpetuity period for these schemes is so long that one would hope that within 80 years we've kind of addressed the underlying problem and nutrient neutrality no longer applies. So if that happens, then I guess ultimately we're kind of in a position where there isn't necessarily a need for the development sector to kind of mitigate in this way and to achieve neutrality. Whether or not there should be a renewed shift to thinking about the fact that, the reason we're in this position on all of these catchments is basically because across all sectors we haven't really paid much attention to nutrient pollution, or at least it's the kind of efforts to tackle it have been relatively slow in bringing down the concentrations in these designated sites. That there should probably still be maybe a kind of mechanism or effort to provide, to make sure that we kind of don't end up back in the same situation again, I suppose. But yes, it's kind of what will happen as and when these sites reach favourable conservation status is a really open question.
Good stuff. We've got a few questions around planting orchards. So we've seen this interesting small residential scheme approved in Cumbria via planting apple trees within the cutledge. Have you seen anything simplistic approved elsewhere, and what are your thoughts on the scalability for this for larger houses, for larger developments?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's been some success, I think, in Somerset as well, people doing that. It works quite well as a means to kind of plant an orchard in a drainage field for a package treatment plant, and it kind of basically sort of mops up a lot of the pretty much all of the phosphorus pollution and nitrogen as well, to be fair, that will come from the package treatment plant. So I think in terms of doing it for larger developments, again, you're kind of in this place like with short rotation coppice that you're only, an orchard can only take up as many nutrients as are in the kind of source of water, that goes to it, and obviously with the limitation of what trees can actually uptake themselves. So you would kind of, again, if you could plant some orchards and irrigate them with a high nutrient water source, they would, happily take up nutrients from that water source and act as a mitigation measure. But it's kind of more about how you get the kind of nutrients there in the first place to be locked up in the trees and in the fruit.
So can you stack stewardship benefits and nutrient neutrality kind of benefits?
No, I think countryside stewardship, all of the kind of agri-environment schemes, I don't think are compatible with nutrient neutrality or BNG, as far as I'm aware. I'd caveat BNG, I'm not 100% sure. Nutrient neutrality, I don't think they are.
Yeah. If a non-invasive, non-native vegetation removed more phosphorus than a native vegetation, it would be better to plant that to also seek biodiversity gain, which could come from separate works.
sorry, so is that saying
non-invasive but non-native vegetation removed more phosphorus than the native
non-invasive
vegetation?
but non-native? I would probably defer to. I'd probably say we would still always look at the using native vegetation. Ultimately, you want to be promoting. Nutrient neutrality is the kind of, I guess, sort of main driver for the schemes we're looking at. But realistically, we also want to make sure that they're having a good environmental impact across a whole range of other benefits. Yeah, we'll. I think I would probably tend towards saying, for the wider kind of benefit that these schemes could generate in terms of biodiversity in particular, that probably prefer not to do that unless there was like a really, really, really good argument for doing it, I suppose. Yeah, I'd probably err to saying no, I would rather not do that, basically, because I think and stick to the kind of wider benefits that can be delivered by those schemes.
Good stuff. You can use wetlands in the freely draining can you use wetlands in freely draining permeable catchments? In such areas, can wetlands drain into ground as opposed to having an outlet into the river?
No, well, you can. So yes, you can use them in those areas, but no, you wouldn't want them to drain to ground. You can use them by basically putting in a liner that basically hydraulically isolates the wetland from its surrounding kind of free draining soil environment. You wouldn't want it to infiltrate for two reasons. One is that nitrogen will potentially still remain stuck. Nitrogen doesn't really stick to soil very well. So if you're in a nitrogen catchment, and even if you're not, to be honest, if you're kind of putting that high input source into an area where nutrient source into an area where it's going to drain into the soil, you're potentially just shoving the nitrogen into an aquifer that will then pop up sometime down the line in some years to come in a water body. And then you've also got with phosphorus, it will just start enriching soil with phosphorus and potentially then move on after many years, and you don't get the same control over the kind of engineering spec that you can use to quantify what outputs you're getting from a wetland. So yeah, one of the requirements in the framework that Natural England have produced is basically that the wetland is hydraulically isolated from its surrounding environment, which will require, generally it's done with like a puddle clay liner. You kind of bash a load of clay up in the bottom of a wetland to make sure it doesn't leak too much water to the surrounding environment.
Good stuff. As water companies are going to have to address treatment by 2030, have you any examples where Natural England have accepted a mitigation scheme only running until 2030? No examples, but there is definitely going to be this kind of set of like bridging measures that are going to be brought forward, because there is obviously this massive reduction. A lot of developments, particularly, I mean, even developments that have that are connecting into treatment works already have phosphorus permits of 1 milligram per litre. If the levelling up bill passes and the upgrade program goes ahead and it's done by 2030, those housing developments will require about a 5-fold decrease in the amount of mitigation per house, and it can be as much as 40-fold decrease if you're connecting into treatment works that doesn't have any phosphorus stripping technologies at it, but is going to be upgraded as a consequence of the levelling up bill. So there is this really big disparity between what's needed now and what might be needed in 2030. For nitrogen, it's more like about a 3-fold decrease, which is going to happen in almost all cases, because there's very few treatment works in the affected areas that have nitrogen removal technologies at them. So there is this need for potentially looking at bridging solutions. I am actually doing a project for Natural England at the moment, which is kind of looking at temporary mitigation measures, and yeah, they're looking to bring stuff forward themselves, and there is obviously just an opportunity, I think, to look at how, if you have, say, a scheme that only delivers what you need after 2030, it might make sense to look at bridging solutions up to 2030 to kind of close that gap, so you don't need to over specify a scheme for the period after 2030. Good stuff. Have you had any issues with obtaining abstraction permits for wetlands, particularly in drought affected areas, and how have you overcome this?
We haven't actually brought any wetland schemes forward ourselves, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that. I think it would always be a consideration, and again, linking back to the types of schemes that we would look to deploy. Like I said, we're not recommending those online wetlands, the ones that take water out of rivers, and that's part of the reason why, is that you're going to have to go through a probably quite onerous process of getting an abstraction license from Natural England. And if you look at Norfolk, for example, like that's one of the most water stressed areas of the entire country. So you are definitely going to have to make some pretty serious arguments for why taking water out of a river is a good idea for this particular purpose. When you're looking at wastewater treatment works, and there's treatment wetlands, so putting a wetland at the end of a sort of point source of nutrient pollution, that could actually have benefits, sort of potentially for water resources. It could have negatives as well. It could increase evaporation. Part of the process would be figuring that stuff out, but you're not going to need an abstraction license because you're taking water from a source before it gets discharged into a river, treating it, then discharging it, and it's going to have a fairly small impact and potentially a positive impact on available water, on water resources.
Good stuff. Do CSO bypass wetlands? If not, how do wetlands cope with high flows?
Do CSOs bypass wetlands? Is that the question? Yeah. And I guess the hydraulic design for a wetland treatment works, if there's also a CSO at the treatment works, would basically probably not take the flows necessarily from the CSO. It's an interesting question. I think wetlands at CSOs is definitely something that kind of seen here and there, and people talking about it a bit more. They're obviously harder to design because you've got this kind of intermittent flow issue, and the concentrations of nutrients going into them is going to be highly variable depending on flow conditions and things like that. So yeah, the ideal situation for a treatment wetland at something like a wastewater treatment works or another sort of more consistent point source of discharge would be that you basically take the consistent point source, because you can design a system well around that, and then you might look at potentially including something like CSO inputs, but it's likely that the CSO element would probably be left off because it's hard to design around what that would actually, a system that can incorporate those high flows, and also what that means for the nutrient removal potential.
So have you looked at bridging options on agricultural land that use low fertilizer input to reduce runoff?
No, we haven't. And again, this kind of bridging measure thing with the 2030 upgrade program, if it goes ahead, is all of these types of solutions potentially have legs, and I think it's just a case of how you specify them, really. As I mentioned, Natural England are working on. I'm working on this project for them to set values for kind of a nutrient mitigation agri-environment scheme that is going to be looking at basically paying farmers to do stuff involving managing the land in a way that helps to take nutrients out of the environment, and it's going to be a temporary set of solutions to meet to bridge the gap up to 2030. That's why they're doing it. So these other solutions, I think, if you can make a decent argument around deploying them, any would probably be happy to, and how they'd be deployed, and I think any would be happy to kind of look at that as well.
Good stuff. What's your understanding on whether nutrient neutrality credits could be locked in if, say, a wetland were to be created adjacent to a water treatment works that's due to be upgraded in 2030? Would the credits effectively fall away at that point?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again, Kim?
What's your understanding on whether nutrient neutrality credits could be potentially locked in if, say, a wetland were to be created adjacent to a water treatment works that's due to be upgraded in 2030?
Right.
Would the credits effectively fall away at that point?
Yeah. I think this is why, as I mentioned before, there's all of this kind of unknown around the number of future viable sites for wetlands taking flow from wastewater treatment works because of these upgrades in 2030. So, my understanding would be, if you can design a system where it starts off with a higher input concentration, and will generate like a, however much mitigation that generates. Then once that upgrade happens, you would get less mitigation from that wetland, and that would deliver, post 2030. There are big questions around whether or not, wetlands basically, I think, at very low phosphorus concentrations and lower nitrogen concentrations, albeit I think the nitrogen concentrations from that will be achieved at the upgrade of wastewater treatment works are still probably sufficient to get nutrient mitigation from a wetland, because they're going for like 10 milligrams per litre, and I've seen sort of studies that show wetlands still delivering, reductions at kind of values, input concentrations of lower than that. But I think for phosphorus in particular, you could run into hot water where the permit levels of 0.25 milligrams per litre are really stringent, 0.3 milligrams per litre are really stringent, and they, you won't basically be able to reduce that by much more, so you won't really get a huge amount of benefit once that upgrade comes in. So yeah, I think this upgrade program has a real material risk in kind of seriously limiting the opportunities for deploying wetlands at wastewater treatment works, because you're not going to do it for, it's going to take a couple of years probably if you started tomorrow to get one through, maybe 18 months, which means you've got, sort of between 5 and 6 years of real benefit from it. So yeah, I think it's a big issue. The water sector are lobbying government, as mentioned, about this. There's an interesting briefing note out by Water UK basically saying, in doing this, you're going to massively stymie investment in nature-based solutions to this problem. So it'd be interesting to see whether or not that lobbying has any effect on the final bill.
Good stuff. Are you talking to water companies, engineers about ongoing integrated construction wetland designs for a secondary treatment of sewage for treatment works? Anglian Water have come up with have one up and running in Norfolk at the moment.
Yeah, I mean that is exactly what the treatment wetland approach is doing exactly that. I think I mentioned previously those couple of examples from Norfolk, and yeah, that's exactly what we'd be looking to replicate where a kind of scheme like that comes along. I mean, the reason we're not kind of pursuing these in as much with as much kind of in as much the same way with the other land management solutions is just that they're much more complex and kind of time consuming to get off the ground. So we think there's lots of opportunities for these other solutions in the agricultural landscape, which will be a lot kind of easier and quicker, and probably in total might add up to a similar quantum of mitigation than kind of big strategic wetland schemes. But yeah, that is effectively the solution that we're advocating as well, that was just kind of explained there.
A question coming, which was just NGOs were lobbying for this. Last two questions. So riparian buffers, what width of buffer is typically recommended, and is there a minimum width?
Yes, there is a minimum width, which is generally established to be about 6 meters wide. What width is recommended? Interesting question. There is currently some kind of attempt to get a width-based efficiency figure kind of accepted by Natural England, where effectively saying the wider the buffer, the more effective it is at taking nutrients out of the environment. I don't really agree with this. The evidence it's based on is not particularly compelling. So I think ultimately, if you've got bigger input sources to a buffer, you will want it to be wider to tackle those sources. But if you have relatively low input sources, you could make a buffer a mile wide, and it's not going to give you a better, a larger amount of reduction beyond the fact that you'd be taking a lot of farmland out of production. So, yeah, there's a sort of minimum, but there isn't really a maximum.
Good stuff. And final question: how do you find EA permits, fish areas, etc., when using log jams?
How do we find EA permits? Sorry, can you?
How do you find EA permits and fishing licenses when using log jams? I think it's
okay.
One, of how you identify if there are any issues, and number two, how to resolve that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, so permits wise, we have a lot of the sort of discharge permits data nationally already. We would need to do a freedom of information request around fishing licenses as part of the the feasibility process. Obviously, you know, we'll be working with landowners on this, and one question for them, which they should know, is, you know, is this a fished? Is there any fishing on this stream? As I mentioned previously, one of the things we need to think about when it comes to altering river systems is fish passage. Clearly, the Environment Agency won't be particularly keen on us introducing barriers to fish movement, given that there's so much work more broadly to remove barriers to fish movement. So, you know, that could be a problem with feasibility on some of these schemes that we need to take into account.
Good stuff. That was the final question. I think we can wrap up there.
Great, amazing, fantastic attendance here. Great, we've still got 50 odd people on the webinar, even though we've gone massively over. So appreciate everyone sticking around to listen to the Q&A. Yeah, hope it was useful for those who've been on the call. And obviously, yeah, you can find us online if you've got any questions. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, all.